And what I'm seeing is businesses are cutting development time by like 60 to 70% for certain types of problems. So it's not building 70% of a solution. That's not what I mean, but they're building complete solutions like 60 to 70% faster. So that's and I have my own experience with that I'm going to share here in a little while, where I had like some real world business experience of vibe coding and really putting it into action. That prototype did a couple things. First off, it got immediate buy-in from stakeholders because they could actually use it. You know how they say like a picture is worth 1,000 words or something like that. A prototype like this is worth like 1,000,000,000 words. Like you could go through and have so many different drawings and UX designs and stuff, but when they can actually feel something and use it and it becomes real to them, and it's a lot easier to have the conversation.
Welcome to the AI Strategy Lab podcast with your host, Jimmy D.
Hey, welcome to the AI Strategy Lab podcast, and this is Jimmy, and I'm going to be your host here today. So I've been diving into vibe coding pretty heavily over the last year or so, and I've been listening to what a lot of vibe coders are saying and talking about in businesses and how they're using it. And I kept getting reminded of this framework that I used to use, and it's called the 70-20-10 framework. I don't know if you've ever heard of that or not, but it's an old framework used in many different contexts, sometimes marketing and product development and different things like that. But I think this 70-20-10 framework can actually apply to how to think about vibe coding and what you should be using vibe coding for and things like that. So I'm going to share some real examples from my own experience and kind of what I'm seeing out there in the market as well, in terms of when you should use vibe coding and when you shouldn't use vibe coding. So first off, we'll look at some specific use cases. So we're going to look at things like internal tools, MVPs, automation scripts, and then I'm going to show you how to categorize them into this 70-20-10 framework. Then I'm going to break down workflow that kind of fits more in the 20% category, which is like kind of what I'm going to call like the hybrid category, in which you would fit into that. And then we'll talk about the 10%. And then I want to talk about like ROI on this stuff. I love to talk about ROI and talk about real numbers on how this can like save you money in your business. So look, if you're driving, you're doing some chores, or you're trying to figure out how AI fits in your business strategy, let's dive in. So first off, vibe coding. If you're not really sure what that is, let me like break it down for you a little bit quickly. So vibe coding's when you sort of describe what you want to build to a large language model in plain English, and then it generates the code for you. It generates the front end, the way it looks, things like that. So you don't need to know any syntax or programming or anything like that. You're just explaining what you want, and the software spits it out, and it's something kind of new and innovative that's going on right now in the world of application development. So I've also been like reading through some forums and looking at some different case studies and Reddit threads, and I love to do that as I'm like researching these topics. And what I'm seeing is businesses are cutting development time by like 60 to 70% for certain types of problems. So it's not building 70% of a solution. That's not what I mean, but they're building complete solutions like 60 to 70% faster. So that's and I have my own experience with that I'm going to share here in a little while, where I had like some real world business experience of vibe coding and really putting it into action. But I kept seeing that pattern around how people are thinking about this, and this whole 70-20-10 thing came to mind. So I wanted to share this with my audience here. So here's the framework I'm proposing based on kind of what I've been seeing. So when you look at all the problems in your business, so anything that could be solved that you would want to solve with using software or something like that, all the inefficiencies, all the manual work going on, things that are slowing you down, I really think there's like a strategic way to take all those problems and divide them up. So let's talk about the 70%. So the 70%, I believe, should just be vibe coded. So these are your things like internal inefficiencies, your repetitive tasks, your information bottlenecks, dashboards, things like that. I'm seeing that you can solve a lot of these problems with vibe coding, and you can do it like 60, 70% faster than traditional development. So you're talking like solving these problems in days instead of like months. So for these problems, I don't believe you need them like fully polished or performant or anything like that to make them go away. So I think like 70% of things in your problem backlog probably can be solved using vibe coding. So let's talk about the 20% of the 70-20-10 framework. So the 20% is what I'm thinking of as like hybrid things. So this is where you this is where you would want to start with vibe coding to kind of validate solutions and then bring in some like pros to polish them, right? So these are the problems that touch customers indirectly, or solutions that you may need to like build and then scale them, or ideas that you're not sure whether they'll work and you need to get product market fit or something. That's this where the 20% of all your problems should kind of fit there. Like they're good enough to vibe code to kind of get some ideas going, but they're not good enough to really like push out into the market. And they might need some polish or something on top of them. But you can start with vibe coding and end with development. And then there's probably like 10% that you should never touch vibe coding. You should never use it for vibe coding. You should never solve these problems with it. These are things like core business problems, anything that's really complex involving security or sensitive data, complex business logic, things like that. So that should be like traditional development from day one at this point, because these tools, quite frankly, are not ready for this type of thing. So what's powerful about this is it's not about the technology, it's about the strategic problem solving. So that's how I want you to think about this. It's like, how, of all the problems that I have, like what can be solved with vibe coding and what really shouldn't be, and how should I categorize those? And for me, this is like just being really intentional about which problems need kind of the elegant solutions versus like which ones need to be solved very quickly, in kind of like in a scrappy way. So let me give you some examples and some real life things here in this 70% category. So that 70% category in the 70-20-10 framework, these are like problems that are like perfect for vibe coding, in my opinion. So what I'm seeing businesses do here is like things like internal dashboards and like reporting tools. So like every business, probably yours as well, if you're running a business or in a business, they don't need to be like beautiful. They just need to tell you the information and bring the data together and things like that. So they just need to work, right? The other thing is sales dashboards, things like sales dashboards, inventory tracking, employee scheduling, all these types of things that are, kind of like repetitive and kind of predictable. You can build these kind of solutions 60 to 70% faster than traditional development. Another category here is like one-off automations and like scripts and stuff like that, like things that you just want to process that are, like I said, really predictable. Connect a couple APIs together, whatever. Like those types of things are accessible and can solve problems pretty quickly, just depending on what you've got going on. Another use case here is marketing microsites and landing pages. This is one I love so much because one of the hard things to do is like spin up a bunch of landing pages to test. And with vibe coding, you can do this in a matter of seconds. You can launch like 10, 15 different versions of a page with different copy and all kinds of stuff. And then, ABCD test them and see what messaging resonates. So I really love that use case. Another one is around education and training applications. So things like custom onboarding tools. So think about new employees coming in and how can I onboard them more efficiently? How can I bring them together? Things like training modules, creating things like that very quickly. Could even be like little Quizlets for employees, things like that. These need to be like functional and accessible, but they don't necessarily need to be like 100% polished, right? Look, these things can like look very basic. It doesn't really matter, in my opinion, how well they look or how polished they are, because as long as they solve the problem and you can do it faster than like 5 months of development work or something like that, then why not? So I'll give you a real example. I was starting working with a brand recently, and they were like really super risk averse about AI. And believe it or not, even like, in 2025 when I'm filming this here, very risk averse. And the product team didn't even have access to a large language model to where, people were using their own personal, devices to try to make their work more efficient. And then I found out the IT department had access to Amazon Bedrock, which is kind of an instance of, you can test a lot of different large language models. You can build tools on top of it, different things like that. So, I convinced the IT department to give me access, and then I used my vibe coding skills to just build a simple chat interface that kind of connected our enterprise Amazon Bedrock large language model in there, and connect it to this chat interface that I vibe coded in maybe like 2 days or so. I think it took me, not even full days, just maybe a couple hours of over a couple different days. And yeah, and then the team was able to use it, and it helped them with like writing requirements and brainstorming, and you name it, all the stuff that they were working on. It helped them be much faster, and they were very happy. And so this is my situation. It wasn't pretty. It didn't have all the features of ChatGPT. It didn't, it didn't it did do images. I was able to figure out how to paste images into it, which was kind of cool. But the bottom line is it solved an expensive problem that we had, and that's the team was just moving slower without AI assistance. And you know it was internal, it was a group of people, and it didn't really need to be perfect. So 70% category in action, like these problems usually sit in the backlog forever, because who wants to spend, 15 grand or 50 grand or 100 grand or something like that to in like time and effort to build these things. Uh they just kind of stay in the bottom of the backlog, and these problems that are pretty important sometimes, they don't actually get solved. The more, sexy problems get solved. But with vibe coding, you can knock them out in days, like I did, in a couple days. And so, uh, yeah, that's the 70% category. So now we'll talk about the 20% category, and this is where I think it gets a little bit strategic, and you got to really think about these use cases. But these are the problems where vibe coding alone won't really solve the problem, but it'll get you part of the way there, and that's the goal, right? So this is where you want to think about like MVPs. So like if you're building a new product, or you are wanting to test a new feature or something like that, validate some kind of concept with users. This is great to use this tool to kind of get you part of the way there. So what I'm seeing is a lot of startups like are doing this consistently. Like they're building like little vibe coded applications, and they're trying to get quick validation from the market. They get validation, and then if they get validation, they move it into like a more production environment where developers can kind of take advantage of the work that had been done on the front end to um, you know get the flow exactly right and things like that, to where they just really need to kind of polish the tool up from there. So customer facing tools that aren't critical is another category. So maybe it's I don't know, a calculator on the website, or a simple customer portal or something like that. You can start these with vibe coding, see if customers actually use it, see if it helps them. And if they do, if it does, then great. Like, go figure out how to make it uh, faster, better, so on and so forth, right? Another one's internal tools that succeeded and need to scale. So once you sort of get something like your internal, like let's say you built an inventory system with vibe coding, and now the whole warehouse wants to use it or something like that, and or you want to scale it out across other distribution centers. Now it's time to bring in developers to kind of make it more robust. So that's another kind of 20% here. So the workflow here is what I'm seeing work like really well is vibe code first, get it in front of people, validate it, get the feedback, then make the decision to invest in more, professional development. So one example from my own experience at a previous company, we needed to redo a kind of we'll say it, a critical flow on our e-commerce site. So if I were to go through the normal process, design resources, mock-ups, approvals, all of these things, we're probably looking at like months before we'd even have something to test. So I used vibe coding to kind of build a working prototype, and it wasn't production ready. Customers couldn't use it, but it was functional. So you could click through the experience, you could kind of see how it worked, you could kind of understand the experience, and it took me about a week total to kind of get it how I wanted it. Again, it was probably not 40 hours worth of a week. It was probably more like 6 hours max, maybe 5. But 6 hours in 5 versus months is a ton of time and faster to market kind of stuff. So that prototype did a couple things. First off, it got immediate buy-in from stakeholders because they could actually use it. You know how they say like a picture's a what is it? A picture's worth 1,000 words or something like that. Um, a prototype like this is worth like 1 billion words. Like you could go through and have so many different drawings and UX designs and stuff, but when they can actually feel something and use it and it becomes real to them, and it's a lot easier to have the conversation. So it gave the development team like a really clear reference for what we wanted. Also, so like after we kind of got our stakeholders buy-in, we took it to the development team. They were very clear on what the flow should be, how it should look, what's the fonts, different things. So they took that prototype, rebuilt it, in a proper way, and also maybe set some expectations for the product team that, hey, this is yeah, we can't do this, those kind of things. So that's just part of the negotiation process with all of that. But look, that's the power of that 20% category. So there's 20% of stuff that is sitting in the backlog or problems that you want to solve that you are using vibe coding just for speed and validation, and then investing in the quality once it works. So, what's smart about this is, like, think about this, you're de-risking the investment. Like, instead of spending $50,000 up front, you spend a few days validating it. That's worth 50,000, right? So if you kind of think about opportunity costs and things like that, you may have just saved yourself 50 grand of upfront development work. So let's talk about the 10% category. There's a 10% category. You should never, ever use vibe coding. You just shouldn't do it. It's not ready for it. I talked about this in one of the previous episodes. It's just not ready for prime time from what I'm seeing. But this is things like your core product. So, whatever your customers are actually paying you for, you probably shouldn't vibe code into that. Security critical systems like payment processing, authentication, anything touching like sensitive data, just be careful with it. Complex business logic, sophisticated algorithms, things like that, just have to be really careful with it. So what I'm seeing consistently is developers like warning about this out in the market. If you look around enough, you in some of the forums about vibe coding and stuff, they are just very much like negative about how some people think about vibe coding. So just be aware there's 10% of things that you should not probably use vibe coding for and use traditional development. So let's talk numbers, because that's what really matters in my opinion. So traditional development for internal tools. So what I'm seeing is, you might spend like $15,000 to $50,000 for some tool to be built, maybe 2 to 3 months timeline, depending on your the cost of your development. But vibe coding, the same project, let's say it's like I said, 60 to 70% faster to market. That 3 month project becomes 3 to 4 weeks. I mean, that changes everything, right? Like, think about that savings that you have from 2 to 3 months to 3 to 4 weeks. So that's pretty good. And let's say, like, another way to think of this, like, let's say you have 10 problems to solve this year, and you were going to go down like the traditional approach. You may build like 2 or 3 of those 10 things in the backlog because of budget and time constraints and things like that, and the rest kind of stay on the wish list indefinitely, as in my experience. But with the 70-20-10 approach, like, this is kind of linear, but let's say 7 problems get completed completely with vibe coding. Let's say 2 of them are hybrid treatment. You kind of have this like rapid development, and then you go and polish them later. And then one of them, you decide to fully traditionally develop them. So you're not just saving time and money, you're actually solving like all 10 of the problems. This is kind of a very elementary way of thinking of this 70-20-10, but it's true. Think about it. If you can only get 2 to 3 things out of your 10 done in a given time frame in a given year, but you find out you can vibe code, 6 or 7 of those and solve those smaller problems that are actually kind of like really big problems that can save time and money, over time you end up winning in the long run financially and in the market. So look, that's a strategic advantage here. Same solutions are delivered faster, where polish doesn't matter. So look, if you want to implement this, I have some recommendations. First off, just audit all your problems to solve. Find a list or make a list of all like the possible solutions to those problems, list them out. Every tool you wish you had, every automation you wanted, every product idea, just don't filter anything, just get it all, down on paper, or if you have a backlog of things, grab that backlog of things and then start to categorize them. So kind of just be honest about what you think falls into each bucket. So is it like we talked about earlier, is like an internal tool, an internal dashboard or something that goes in your 70% bucket? Is it something that's possibly customer facing? Maybe we vibe code that and then we polish it up later. That's your new 20% bucket. New payment system, definitely in the 10% bucket. So for the 70% category, just start, like just pick this easiest one. Use you can use like Claude Code, you can use Cursor, V0, Lovable. There's so many different tools. Get familiar with them, start testing them. It really doesn't matter. Just kind of get started and see if you can solve the problem with it. See if you can get to the finish line with some of these problems, and see if the internal customers, your internal customers, or your whatever customers are using them and like them. For that 20% category, plan it out a little bit more. So how are we going to approach this? So maybe you think, is this worth investing in? Should we, maybe vibe code this and then put it in front of people, test it with users? Then maybe you don't invest in it. And that's another outcome that could happen there. And then for the 10% category, budget for proper development. Just don't try to cut corners here. Just go and just do anything in that 10% category, do it. Document it all. See what, then you can work around and have fun and try to figure out what prompts work for vibe coding, like what patterns can you see emerging and what problems that you can run into, and just start to build your own playbook around how I can now, build these tools within my business without needing to hire developers. And there's a lot of problems you can solve. And once you start to figure those out, you will probably change the way you think about developing these things in the future. So look, vibe coding is not magic. It's just not, it is some work. You have to be a little bit crafty. It's not, ready for prime time. But when you apply it strategically and you think about this 70-20-10 framework I talked about, and you think about like, where does this problem fit in, it becomes a really powerful tool. So again, just to recap, the 70% are for those things that are, you can get to market like 60-70% faster. And it's just for things that are not, they're not partial solutions. They're going to be like complete solutions that solve the problem. And maybe they don't just need to be pretty or anything, right? And that 20% are for things that you want to maybe test and market, and the 10% don't touch them. So look, it's not about technology, it's about strategic resource allocation, in my opinion. So it's really thinking about, how do I be strategic with my money? How do I be strategic with my resources? Things like that. And it's also about recognizing problems that don't need to be polished. They don't need to be pretty. They just need to be solved. And these tools can do that. And I'm like living proof of it in real use cases where you can vibe code your way to solve some problems for businesses or teams or, whatever. So look, this is what we explore here at the AI Strategy Lab, this kind of stuff. I like to talk about practical frameworks for strategic AI implementation. I don't like to talk about hype or anything other than just practical approaches that actually work. So thank you for joining me today. If you're using vibe coding or thinking about it, I'd really be curious to hear how you're categorizing your problems. Put a comment in. This is for those watching on YouTube. Please put a comment and let me know. Till next time, keep thinking strategically about AI, and we'll talk to you soon.